going to go into presentation mode. Is that good?
Yep,
That way?
fine.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Over to you, sir.
Cool. All right. Well, I'm just going to sit right here then so they can see me too here. I apologize. I usually stand, as you know, me, I sort of run around the room and not, but we'll keep it low key, I guess. Yeah, so this is actually kind of, in some degrees, an expansion of an exhibit that some of you may have seen at the Old Berwick Historical Society a couple of years ago, where Nina Maurer and I put together an exhibit on really on the Piscataqua region, particularly, frankly, Kittery and Elliott and South Berwick in the 17th century, with the emphasis being on how different this place was. And I think most of us in the room realize and appreciate how different our history is than once you get south of the Merrimack River. Right? You know, I taught at Salem State now for my 29th year, and I still feel something very different when I drive to work. When I cross that first bridge into New Hampshire, things haven't changed all that much. And, you know, but once you cross that second bridge down at Amesbury and you cross the Merrimack, it's like you're in up for combat, right? So you're entering a different world. And bottom line is, folks, to me, in some degrees, I think it's always kind of been that way. And I guess I've spent most of my professional career trying to explain to people south of the Merrimack, if you will, that there were two New Englands in the 17th century, the Puritan one down there and the one up here, which is very different. So really, this is kind of a talk about that exhibit, and that sort of has a lot of the artifacts and material culture from that exhibit and some other work that I've done over the years as well too. Oops, I don't want to do that. All right. Oh, I didn't want to see the chat. I should be able to advance this. Can I click and advance this?
Yeah.
All right. In theory.
If it works.
In theory.
Yep.
All right, that's working.
Sure.
All right. All right. So this is the. So this is the exhibit, if you did get a chance to see it, and whoops, getting the hang of this. My point is, as I say, is that Puritan New England was none of the above, and that Maine and New Hampshire were the other New England. What do I mean by that? Not Puritan, but a variety of different religious groups in New Hampshire and Maine. Yes, there were Puritans, but also Anglicans, Quakers, Baptists, even odd splinter groups like Muggletonians. By the way, I think J.K. Rowling knew what Muggletonians were, which probably, I wonder, I think this, if I ever get, I'd love to meet her and ask her, say, so Muggles, are those Muggletonians? Anyhow, and of course, those people that the Puritans called godless fishermen. Godless meaning like if the codfish are biting on a Sunday, well, guess where you are? It's not in church. And of course, we also have antinomians, including Reverend John Wheelwright and his followers, who founded Exeter in 1638. And then when Massachusetts took over New Hampshire in 1642, where does Wheelwright go? He leaves New Hampshire and moves to Maine, of course, and founds Wells as well. It's a place that one of the leading Puritan magistrates of New Hampshire, Richard Waldron, complained was to the Massachusetts officials was that the region was the harbor for all the rogues in the country. He basically was, and basically what we're really talking here is sort of political excuses by and large for Massachusetts to try to spread its authority into New Hampshire and Maine in the 17th century, under the kind of the trumped up charge, if you will, that the place is lawless and disorderly and they don't have ministers or any of this nonsense, which again is really largely was a political argument of the day for what I would consider to be sort of imperialism by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Not new, because yeah, we know now that native inhabitants have been occupying the land for more than 10,000 years, probably closer to 12,000 years. Not long after the glaciers retreated from the last ice age, native inhabitants were moving north into the region. Right? So again, I think we recognize that now perhaps more than even a few years ago with things like land acknowledgements, but certainly New England was not new to them, right? And also not England. It's a diverse place beyond just that Native American presence. We're talking about the widespread presence of enslaved Africans. Matter of fact, we'll talk about one or two tonight. Scottish prisoners of war, of course, who came over at Dunbar and Worcester, Irish indentured servants, many other Europeans. Now, admittedly, the mainstream of people in northern New England are of English stock. But again, there's a more diversity than I think people would like to admit at the time, or frankly, even today. And of course, here's a picture I take for that example the picture of the McIntyre garrison, built by a descendant of one of those Scottish prisoners of war, and of course the Scotland district of York. Right. I'll talk more about those chaps in a minute. But in fact, actually, I'll start with a story that goes back to actually 3 books ago that I wrote about a debauched Quaker tavern on Great Island in New Hampshire, which sort of encapsulates just how strange and diverse this place was in the 17th century. So we're going to start at a place called Great Island, which of course is now the town of Newcastle. But until the 1690s, it was not. It was part of Portsmouth, and particularly the main tavern on the island was owned by George and Alice Walton, who again were not your sort of typical New England tavern keepers. Thanks. George first comes to Exeter in 1638 as one of those antinomians, and he runs a rather diverse and indeed debauched tavern, a tavern that is supernaturally assaulted by flying stones throughout the summer of 1682. And it's a fascinating case and a fascinating place. When I say debauched, I mean, well, yes, the Puritan government of Portsmouth is constantly making complaints against drunken sailors in the tavern from all over the Atlantic world. One of their household servants is Mary Agawam, and her bastard son William, who actually arrived on this earth after Mary and some foreign sailor fornicating on the Sabbath in the tavern. A couple years before the stone throwing attack, one of the Walton grandchildren drowned in an open well. The neighbors complained about it. A cow drowned in the well. We're never really quite sure what happened. I refer to them in my book, The Devil of Great Island. I refer to them as being the neighbors from hell, the Waltons, right? It'd be like, and maybe today it might be like living next to a crack house, right? And also, if that isn't bad enough, the Waltons were amongst the leaders, and their tavern was the leader of the opposition to Massachusetts Bay in northern New England, the center of the royalist opposition, loyalists to the Mason family, who were hoping to enforce their, frankly, rather dubious claim to ownership over New Hampshire. Let's see. So when the stones start flying in the tavern, and I won't tell you the full story, but essentially it ends up being in a case of witchcraft. What do the Waltons do but accuse their poor, widowed, elderly Anglican neighbor, Hannah Jones, of being a witch? And as you can see here on the map, Hannah lived here, the Waltons lived down below, and basically the family had been in a property dispute, the 2 different families, going back over 30 years over a couple of acres of marshland. But it was prime location, as always in real estate, right? Location, location, location. And so essentially there'd been this family dispute, which ended up turning into, I think, frankly, an excuse by Walton to accuse his neighbor of witchcraft, I think in the hopes of basically winning the court case over this property. And the story includes all kinds of other interesting people as well, too. Their neighbor to the south is John the Greek Amazine, also known as John the Italian Amazine, who's another one of these sailors who probably stayed in Portsmouth when he met one of the local girls and got married. Probably someone of Greek nationality, or ethnic Greek, who grew up in one of the Greek enclaves in southern Italy. So he could be alternately known as Greek or Italian. But again, when you read the history books of Puritan New England, they don't talk about people like the Waltons and John Amazine, do they? In fact, even Walter Barefoot, who's the local doctor who lives nearby. And he's actually famous for a few years before this, at least to us today, because when New Hampshire officials were trying to basically whip 3 Quaker women out of the colony, it's the Whip and Cart Act, they stripped them to the waist in February, tied them to the tail of a cart, and in every town in the colony, they stopped and whipped them to literally whip them out of the colony. And when they got to Hampton, he put an end to it, saying that you're going to kill these women. Basically, otherwise they would have continued them all the way to Boston, and literally they probably wouldn't have made it there alive. So again, people here were sort of really of different sentiments than to the south. Now, after a few weeks of this attack, as it turns out, this attack, known as a lithobolia attack, the Greek for stone throwing demon, spread upriver to Berwick, Maine, to the home of the Hurtado family. Antonio, again, was another one of these sailors. He was from Fayal in the Azores. His wife, Mary, was an Anglican, the daughter of a West Country fisherman from York. And they lived, so here's where the outbreak started. And then it went up to the edge of the frontier, present day Berwick, Maine. If you head up Route 236 and go way up into the country, that's where they lived, which was about the end of the road in the 17th century. So you have all of these different people in this story, including the Waltons, Irish servant, Dermot O'Shaw or O'Shea, fishermen from the Orkney Islands, the Channel Islands. And also in 1682, when this took place, you have William Scriven and other Baptists leading an effort to form the Second Baptist congregation in New England. I would say much to the disgust of most people, because ironically at the time, hard for us to believe that Quakers and Baptists were sort of the people that feared they were going to bring down the ruin of all society. For reasons I won't even bother to get into, but just to say that the Puritans had sort of near pathological hatred of these people for reasons that, again, seem pretty specious to us. So that's the kind of place that 17th century Piscataqua was. And as I said, I want to talk to it now through the exhibit and the people in it and the sites in it. And a large part I'm sure a lot of you have seen this map before, the map of the Piscataqua region by Colonel John Scott, made about 1665. And you can see the river between New Hampshire and Maine. And also the reason why this map was made, on the left, you see that key, that rectangular key, which shows the location of all the sawmills in the Piscataqua, which it's the sawmills and the codfish that are the economic engine of northern New England. That's the reason Massachusetts wants to run northern New England, is because their merchants need those resources to sell into the Atlantic trade, which is making New England wealthy. In particular, let's go upriver there, because I spent 13 summers excavating there at the, at the Chadbourne site, which is this major fur trading, lumbering, sawmill complex that was constructed in 1643 and destroyed in the Salmon Falls raid in 1690. And you can see here the main house that we excavated. Here's the plan of excavation and reconstruction of what would you think the house looked like. A large two-story house, kind of like the Jackson House, but frankly, probably even a bit bigger than Jackson House down in Portsmouth. And they built this land and built their farm on land purchased from Sagamore Rouse, again, the local native sachem, who apparently became good friends with Humphrey Chadbourne. He actually sold 2 or 3 parcels of land to Chadbourne. And I could give a whole talk about the relationship between them, but that is to say, this was, I think this was an exchange of equals. Rouse really knew what he was selling. And I think Chadbourne probably gave him a pretty fair price. And it's interesting, in the document, Humphrey Chadbourne refers to Rouse as Mr. Rouse. In the 17th century, most people would have just been known as Goodman or Goodwife, Goody, not Mr. or Mrs. Mr. or Mrs. was reserved for the upper crust. You know, maybe like the governor and his wife might be Mr. and Mrs. So referring to Rouse as Mr. clearly suggests that there's some respect and admiration, I think, there, that he's considered to be an equal of Humphrey Chadbourne, if not superior. Anyhow, Humphrey occupies this property, which is at the confluence of the Great Works and the Salmon Falls River, where he builds a sawmill. His father actually had been one of the first people to come to the region in 1634 to build the sawmill, the original sawmill that was constructed on what we now call the Great Works River. And we have, unfortunately for Humphrey, he died kind of young, just 1667. And here is his probate inventory, where he had an estate worth 1,715 pounds. So this guy was a multimillionaire. Most people might leave an estate of 100, 200 pounds, and this is 1,700. And it includes his clothing, one sawmill with utensils and timber worth 300 pounds. So again, that alone itself is probably like a $500,000 million investment today, a sawmill. And a merchant like Chadbourne, who's involved in the Atlantic trade, needs that lumber to ship out into the Caribbean, to bring back things like sugar and other materials coming into New England. And look at this. He has item 5 serving men and maids worth 40 pounds. These are indentured servants. He needs people to work his sawmill. If you have a sawmill and lumber mill operation, That means you need a farm because you need oxen to haul the lumber. You need to grow food to feed the oxen, to feed the workers. So this is a real sort of operation by the standards of the day. And to keep it working, you need lots of people who can do the work and who can do it cheaply. So that involves bringing over indentured servants. You pay their way for their passage to England. In return, they work for you for 5 to 7 years. It's not slavery, but because you're going to be free eventually. But for that time of 5 or 7 years, it's pretty close to slavery. You have very limited rights, right? But that's the way a lot of particularly young unmarried people who wanted to come for the opportunity of the New World would get their chance. So this is how Humphrey and his wife Lucy really kind of make their fortune. And when we excavated the site, we found all kinds of evidence of the activity that was going on there, including the sawmill. You can see that here I am standing with a almost complete pit saw. It doesn't look like much after it's been conserved by iron. It looks a little bit more like gray Swiss cheese with all those. But what it is a pit saw blade 5 feet long that would have been normally used to saw boards, but in this case was probably reused in the sawmill to try to cut boards. And we actually found several sawmill blades as well, and all kinds of other tools: draw knives, hoes, spades, you name it. We also found spoons, including some indicating just how wealthy the Chadbournes were. This spoon right here is a silver spoon. And as you can see from the mark right there, IH or JH, John Hall and RS Robert Sanderson, first American silversmiths. And it also has, you'll note, Humphrey and Lucy Chadbourne's monogram on the spoon right there, HLC, H for Humphrey, L for Lucy, C for Chadbourne. In the 17th century, monograms would just be the husband's first name, wife's first name, and then family name, just the 3 initials. A real rarity to find a silver spoon. Silver was very rare around here for currency or any kind. And this was, the Chadbournes were so wealthy when the coal complex burned down in 1690, they didn't even go bother digging to try to find the missing silver spoon. I think that's one of the first things I would have done. And also too, we knew from the stuff they had the latest fashionable objects from Europe, including English ceramics from the 1680s, the Chinese scholar pattern on the left there. And these are things from the exhibit where we have the small piece at the bottom, and then the big piece up at the top is not from the dig, but is from a local collector to sort of, because, as an archaeologist, I love the small broken bits of stuff, but I think you folks probably appreciate seeing complete things. So in these cases, we find the broken bits of the Chinese scholar, the first kind of Chinese influenced ceramics in England, and also Persian blue, which is an English imitation of a French imitation of Persian porcelain. So again, we're talking about here with pretty sophisticated taste for the 17th century. And even more exotic are these pieces here from 4 different plates or platas of Osea polychrome ware, which was made in Mexico City between 1650, well, in this case, 1690, when the place burned down. It was illegal to trade with the Spanish. This is the first time any Spanish colonial ceramics have been found north of the James River in Jamestown in North America. By rights, it shouldn't be here because it was illegal. The Navigation Act said you can't trade with the Spanish. But again, if you're going down to the Caribbean and you're selling your lumber down there and you're buying goods, well, there's English colonies down there, but there's also French and the Spanish aren't too far away. And we know that we New Englanders have been really good at smuggling since the start of New England, just about. And so they clearly were looking the other way. The officials were looking the other way, being bribed as they were trading with the enemy, frankly, right? And that's what a half of a plate looks like of it from, this is from Florida. So this is from the exhibit where we're sort of show the family tree of these folks, this extended tree of the Chadbournes and the Shapleys, because Lucy Chadbourne, in fact, is the granddaughter of Alexander Shapley, of course, the folks who came from Kittery to found, of course, Kittery, right? And the family's headquarters really being, as we'll see, right at where the Sandy Hill Farm is here in Elliott, right? And I know a lot of you know this history far better than I do, but I just want to make you know that I'm aware of these things. So anyhow, so we have sort of Lucy and Humphrey at the sort of center of this family tree, but then other folks that we talk about in the exhibit, because we try to sort of focus the exhibit on the stories of individuals, which seems to be always much more interesting to me, if possible. And Humphrey and Lucy's neighbor is Humphrey's sister, Patience. and her husband, Thomas Spencer. And they live across the Great Works River in South Berwick, what today is known as Old Fields, which, by the way, was called that because it was old Native American planting grounds. They're old fields, right? And they sort of feature it in the exhibit as well, too. And again, guess what? The Spencers, yeah, they were Quakers too. As a matter of fact, just with inside the family, you could see the divided loyalties that you see in Maine. Here are 3 artifacts we excavated at the site. One, a rare coin that we found at the site was this oak tree 2 pence, dated 1662. And that brings to mind that sort of Puritan power from Massachusetts, the fact that Maine became part of Massachusetts in the 1650s, the fact that Humphrey was a representative to the general court, to the legislature down in Boston. And that also Lucy's brother, Humphrey's brother-in-law, John Trewergy, was a Puritan merchant from Kittery. But he was also appointed governor of Newfoundland by Cromwell, by the Puritans back in England in the 1650s. So you have that branch of the family, but Maine being Maine, and you never knew who was going to be in charge, which political faction. You also had to have your other connections. So of course, in the middle here, we have a Tudor Rose harness boss that we found on the site from, would have been on the hardware of probably of the Chadbournes, a fine riding mare. And so I associate this artifact in this case with probably Humphrey Chadbourne Jr. and certainly Humphrey Sr.'s uncle, Lucy's uncle-in-law, that is Lucy's uncle, and Humphrey's sometime business partner, Nicholas Shapley, who was the leading royalist of northern New England. And a Tudor Rose harness boss would be a dead giveaway for that, because the Tudor Rose is the emblem of the Stuart family, right? And the Tudors. And so this is a sign of loyalty to that family, just as much as when you wear an American flag in your lapel, we know what you stand for, right? It'd be that obvious to people in the 17th century. And even though Maine was nominally under control of the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay, you have members of the family here who are openly sort of saying like, yep, but here's who I'm really loyal to. Right? And then we also found on the site this artifact on the right, which is what we call a Jesuit ring. It's a trade ring from France and would be traded by the local French fur traders and Jesuit priests who were as close as perhaps like Fryeburg, Maine, and Farmington Falls, Maine, and Norridgewock. And that is to say, the Native Americans who traded at the Chadbourne Post and eventually actually attacked it in 1690 and helped destroy it, were also trading with the French. So we have that presence. So you've got all of these people here influencing and politicking, if you will, in the region in the 17th century. So who are some of these other people? Well, again, we turn in the exhibit after we talk about Humphrey and Lucy Chadbourne and Sagamore Rowells. We talk about those connections on both sides of the family. Lucy's uncle Nicholas Shapley, Humphrey's sister Patience Spencer, and their families. And interesting thing here, you're looking at the sort of they're part of the exhibit. And what I love about the fact is, not only were the Spencers Quakers, but again, too, they were tavern owners. And again, here's what a 17th century New England tavern was like. Here's the court proceedings from just one session of people who were brought into court under complaint of one of these taverns in Berwick in 1670. Daniel Goodwin confessed that he struck Humphrey Spencer on the head with a stool. Humphrey Spencer, by the way, is named after his uncle, Humphrey Chadbourne. And ripped from today's headlines, tavern keeper Goodwin admits he was drunk at the time. Meanwhile, 2 men admitted they were at John Gattonby's tavern and getting drunk on the Lord's Day at the time of the sermon. Nicholas Frost, meanwhile, was so drunk that he tried to stab himself with his knife. Again, check out the police logs today. Some things never really seem to change with young fellows and alcohol and knives, right? Anyhow, yes, he was in such condition he did not remember what he did. The court that heard these cases, of course, even met at Gattonby's Tavern because the tavern was the largest building in the community. So again, this is your orderly Puritan Sabbath in the Maine frontier, okay? So again, looking at these connections between the Spencers and the Goodwins and the Gattonbys, these folks are all related. Humphrey Spencer, is the nephew of Humphrey Chadbourne. Daniel Goodwin is Mahitable placed at Goodwin's father-in-law. John Gattonby's Patience's son-in-law. So all these people in this area are all related. And you can see here too, yeah, there's Humphrey right there. You can see where Humphrey Spencer is on the tree. And then you can see his parents. And again, there's Humphrey and Lucy. By the way, on this chart, all the people who own sawmills are in red. And again, you can see that all these families are quite conveniently intermarrying and really kind of creating sort of an extended monopoly, if you will, through marriage of the lumber industry of the Piscataqua, right? From here all the way actually over to Exeter. Looking at some of the artifacts that I associate in the exhibit actually with Patience Spencer, in her probate inventory when she died, and they made an inventory of all of her possessions, it mentions in her probate inventory 3 times Lisbon ware, Lisbon dishes. These are very fancy high-end ceramics, as you can see here, examples of which were made in Lisbon. And again, the small broken pieces are from the Chadbourne dig. Not surprising at all that Humphrey's sister across the river from where his trading post is going to be getting some of the stuff as well. And in this case, we have some complete specimens. This is from the fellow smoking the pipe there is from a private collection in Portsmouth. But look at these 2 pieces. These are plates from the collection of ceramics at the Demers collection at Newcastle Historical Society. A large collection of artifacts that were raised by a father-son team of sport divers, the Demers, Ray and John Demers in the 1970s, that they've donated to the Historical Society, and includes these large, fancy, beautiful Portuguese plates. Interesting thing, folks, talk about breaking the laws. In 1669, Lord Bellomont, the governor of Massachusetts and Maine and New Hampshire and New York, wrote to the Council of Trade and the King in England complaining of criminal acts of his own Lieutenant Governor of New Hampshire, Lieutenant Governor Partridge of Portsmouth, who at the time was shipping New Hampshire timber directly to Portugal in open defiance of the English Navigation Acts. So things are so bad up here that even the government officials are breaking the law and no one's really paying much heed to it. But again, those international connections, right? It's not a surprise that you have someone like Antonio Hurtado here, who comes from the Azores, because we see those connections to Portugal, to the Azores all the time in the artifacts and the records of the 17th century. So Major Nicholas Shapley, you folks probably know more about him than I do, that I confess to being fascinated really with him for decades. He's a really wealthy merchant, even wealthier than Humphrey. Owns a sawmill. He's a Quaker. He's a royalist. He's a slaveholder. He's also the major in charge of the Yorkshire militia. So this is the early days of Quakerism, when Quakers it was still thought it was okay to be violent as opposed to non-violent, right? By being a militia officer and also owning slaves. Early Quakerism was a little bit different in the 1660s and 1670s. And it's really by the time of Nicholas's death in 1682 that the Quakers kind of become the more sort of traditional Quakers we think of today. By the way, Shapley actually was killed when a ship was being launched in Kittery, and the mast fell. One of the masts fell and killed him. You can see here his probate inventory. You see, as an archaeologist, I love these things, and a lot of them are just available in the published court records. But look at here, he has 5 slaves, 3 men, 1 woman, and a child, all worth 90 pounds. And then below this, again, look, 2 Irish boys to serve about 2 years, 1 2 years and 1 3 years, indentured servants as well. He needs these people to work, to run these operations. And he's also hard at work trying to keep Maine and New Hampshire as separate colonies from Massachusetts. Frankly, without a lot of success in Maine's case, in New Hampshire, that does become a separate colony in 1680. They will maintain strong ties to Massachusetts. And of course, I'm sure you're all familiar with the remains. You can see a low tide of the Shapley sawmill in Elliott. It was a tidal mill, and you can see what's left of the dam there for it. It low tide out of the outlet of the mill pond on River Road, just adjacent to the family farm at Sandy Hill, which of course is still owned by the Shapleys. I like, in our exhibit, we like to talk about this. In this case, we talked about Black Will, who was one of those 5 slaves we know that Shapley owned when he died. And in fascinating, we actually have, we don't have the deed of purchase for him, but we do have the deed of purchase of one of Shapley's other slaves that survives in the court records in Boston in the deed records. This is, I think it's in 1676 when he's purchasing Coffee, who's a slave down a slave man down in the Barbados and a enslaved African, and he's buying them and he's moving him up here to work for him. Now, I mention this because we have this sense that, first off, probably this one, most of you know, New England's dirty little secret is that we did have slaves up here. There's been a really good book I'm sure you folks have read about slaves in Kittery. But having said that, I think we have the wrong idea about it. I think we think it's like, yes, slaves certainly would have been status symbols. We think like, well, they were just household servants, nonsense. You needed people to work. Who's going to do that work for you? That you need a control, being a lumberjack and being a sawmill operator is really dangerous work. It doesn't pay all that great either. You need cheap, reliable, controllable labor. And frankly, that's what I think a lot of the enslaved folks were doing here. And in fact, we know that Black Will, who will become free in the 1690s, will become Will Black, of course. Even before he dies, he purchases 100 acres of land here in what's now Elliott. He actually helps a friend of his become free as well and gives him some land. And then here you can see, this is so we have one of our characters in the exhibit is William Black, who once he is freed by the Shapleys, and we're not quite sure if they just freed him or if he had to purchase his freedom. We know he bought land from the Frost family, and he becomes a farmer working his 100-acre farm. And so we sort of show him with some of the tools of the day from the Chadbourne dig associated with farming, hose and a cowbell and milk pans for the dairying, because odd as it is to think of this transported African, perhaps he was a farmer back home even, but here he is in this very strange land, really sort of freed and set out to really kind of establish himself as a farmer. And his descendants are still kicking around and kicking in Maine and elsewhere. And you can see here, what's fascinating to me is not only is Black Will or Will Black a neighbor that they're willing to sell land to, but he's also related. Because if you see here, if you'll see that his son, William Black Jr., marries Elizabeth Turbot, who's the granddaughter of Thomas and Patience Spencer. Yeah. So again, we were a reasonably diverse and accepting kind of place. Have not found a marriage record for these folks. Not sure if either Black Will or his son were allowed to legally marry, but they were allowed to apparently peacefully cohabit with their life partners who were white women. So again, not exactly what you'd expect in Maine in the 17th and early 18th century. Now, when I talk about these, in some degrees, I put the cart before the horse because the enslaved Africans who are here are not the first hard labor. I really think those are the Scottish prisoners of war. One of my favorite groups of people are the Scottish prisoners of war, about 400 of them who were taken prisoner at the battles of Dunbar and Worcester in 1650 and 1651 at the end of what they now call the War of the Three Kingdoms, or which are better known as the English Civil Wars, when the Scots rose up in rebellion against Parliament and the Puritans, but were soundly defeated. And most of them did not survive the harsh captivity, but about 400 were shipped to New England and jobbed out of the Saugus Iron Works with terms of like 5 to 7 years of indenture, just like an indentured servant, kind of a forced indenture because they had no say in the matter, nor were they allowed to go back home afterwards. So they never again saw their wives or family or anybody back in Scotland. But they were given the opportunity once here and they were freed to get land cheap and to have a pretty promising life on their own. But what's interesting to me is these folks basically are the guys that end up working in places like the Saugus Iron Works and all of our sawmills here. And most of the ones that migrate to this area are originally brought in as indentured servants in the sawmills. And when they become free, and many of them continue to work or manage, or in at least one case, maybe even a partial owner of one of these sawmill operations. But here's the problem, folks. About 1658, they've all become free. You have no longer cheap available young Scottish youth to work your mill. Where are you going to find that cheap controllable source of labor? Well, it isn't it interesting that I think the first time there's a reference to an enslaved African showing up in Kittery, I think is in 1662, is the first record of that. I mean, I really think that to some degrees, enslaved people are brought to Maine and New Hampshire to serve as that reliable source of labor once you no longer have the Scots to count on. These people are particularly important to our story. And by the way, a lot of these names that you don't necessarily assume are being Scottish, but are, like Thomas Holmes is the character who actually was the sawmill owner at South Berwick, is where the counting house is now. And a number of years ago, when they were putting in the fish ladder there, the workers threw a spoon up to the president of the board at the time and said, "You want old stuff? Here's an old spoon." And of course, they thought it was a joke because they assumed this was a modern spoon. And we're going like, yeah, that's a dog-nosed spoon, probably from the 1680s. That was Thomas Holmes' spoon, whose garrison was destroyed in the Salmon Falls raid of 1690 right there. How important these people were to the region. In Berwick, which, by the way, the Battle of Dunbar was fought just outside the town of Berwick. And that's what they named their town for. Matter of fact, right, Unity Parish, which was the original name of Elliott and South Berwick, was actually named after the ship the Unity that the first load of Scots came over on. So there's a strong connection there. These guys were housed where in Durham Cathedral. So the towns of Durham, New Hampshire, and Berwick, Maine, are named by these Scots in their honor for their suffering and their presence. Because if you look at this militia list from 1711 from the Berwicks, which included present-day South Berwick, North Berwick, 25% of the households are Scots families. The very elderly Scots by that point were their sons or grandsons. So they were a real presence here. Well, this region was relatively peaceful and had a fairly good relations with the Native Americans until King Philip's War in 1675. And in fact, actually, the Chadbourne site we know was attacked then because we found flattened musket balls along where the walls were, and where the balls had hit the wall and it just mushed the musket balls. So they survived that raid pretty well in this region, but not the next war. Unfortunately, after King Philip's War, there was a kind of a truce that lasted about a dozen years, but fighting commenced again in 1689, and it's largely over by this time. Sort of, when the English first buy the land here from the Native Americans, Sagamore Morales is going like, "What's the harm? It's only a family too. Humphrey seems like a nice guy." Well, yeah, within 30 or 40 years, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of English settlers, right? And they're getting in the way of the Native American. The English cows are eating the Native American corn. The English fishermen are stealing all the fish for bait, and the Native Americans can't catch the fish, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of growing tensions that result in a series of wars that last in northern New England really until the fall of Quebec in 1760. But there's a major attack in this region, at least in Berwick, is the Salmon Falls raid in 1690, which virtually destroys all the settlements in what's now South Berwick, really north of the Great Works River. Over 100 people killed, over 40 taken captive. The group, a combined French and Native American force, march overland from Quebec in the dead of winter on snowshoes, attack at dawn of a sleeping village. Back then, no one fought in the middle of winter. But so they really had the advantage of people. People thought they were safe. And so a dawn attack and just took people completely by surprise, marched captives back to Canada. The raid is led by Joseph Francois Hertel de la Fresnière. And interestingly enough, his teenage son, Jean-Baptiste, is on that raid with him as one of his assistants. And Jean-Baptiste is the one that will go on to fame, to the point that we actually do have his portrait. He's actually knighted by the King of France, in large part because he was the fellow who made the even more devastating raid on Deerfield in 1704, very famous raid. And he uses the exact same tactics his dad taught him at South Berwick. Marching overland in winter on snowshoes, attack at dawn, and similar devastating effects. So the last two people we talk about in the exhibit actually are captor and captive. We talk about Jean-Baptiste Hertel, and his captive, Mehetabel Plaisted Goodwin. Again, another member of kin of the extended Chadbourne Spencer clan. And she's in captivity up there for several years before she and her husband both. She had lost her father, Captain Plaisted, Roger Plaisted in King Philip's War. In the raid in 1690, she loses an infant child. She loses her brother. She and her husband are marched off in captivity, and she's captive for almost 4 years. Amazingly enough, they both get home. And in fact, she's actually, you can see her gravestone in Oldfields. She lived, I think, till about, I think it's about 1750, lived to a pretty ripe old age. Basically, folks, after that raid, though, Berwick is largely abandoned, at least temporarily, and it really is the bleeding edge of the frontier. I really think for the rest of their life, Mehetabel and her husband, I think everybody in this area would have had PTSD back then, frankly, right? And I think it would be one of these deals like you say, okay, Hetty, I'm going hunting. Remember, you hear one gunshot, that's good, we got deer for dinner. You hit two, run like hell for the garrison, because it's another attack. And that's, so kind of like today when you hear a siren, you don't think much of it, right? But you hear two or three and see black smoke and you start to go, oh, okay. So that's kind of what life was like here. Now, I've talked long enough, but just a couple closing thoughts. And one is that I've written a whole book talking about the connections between the Salem witch trials and the Maine frontier, which I believe were really triggered by some of these events, and particularly the raid on York in 1692, in January 1692. That actually I'll be talking about a couple of weeks on a Zoom talk at Historic New England. I can send you folks the link for that when I get it. And I won't go into the details on that. But I will say that talking about the Salem witch trials, really, I want to talk briefly about religion, because if you look at the same network of people, again, you look at these religions and who they are. Again, Humphrey and Lucy, as far as we can tell, good God-fearing Puritans. Otherwise, you're not going to be allowed to be a member of the legislature in Massachusetts. But again, Uncle Nicholas Shapley, Quaker, and Thomas and Patience Spencer, Quakers. You have Richard Leader, who's an in-law, who is the Muggletonian, another sawmill owner and operator. And then you have a whole bunch of folks who are amongst those folks at Kittery Point, creating that first Baptist church in 1682. And interestingly enough, again, the Baptists, even in Maine, the Baptists are given such a hard time by the officials that they are essentially sort of forced out of the colony. But Scriven and a number of the followers, including members of the Cutts family, end up moving south to more tolerant ground in South Carolina, where Scriven is considered to this day to be the founder of the Southern Baptist movement. So Maine and Piscataqua is such a diverse place in the 17th century that the Southern Baptist movement was founded at Kittery Point in 1682. You heard it here first. The other thing I want to talk about is the diversity of where people come from. The other thing too is we have this kind of mythology, I think, of the East Anglian Puritans, again, who took over New England. But in fact, about 20% of the settlers who come to New England in the 17th century are from the West Country of England, that leg pointing into the Atlantic, Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, and adjacent counties. And about half the people in Maine probably were from that region. These are folks, it's a lot like our neck of the woods, folks. Rocky coasts, poor farmland, lots of grazing of livestock, lots of shipbuilding and fishing. And of course, the Chadbournes and the Shapleys are from this region as well, too. In particular, the Shapley family is from Kingswear, which is the port right across the river from the major West Country port of Dartmouth. And interestingly enough, you can see right there on the map. And then also, too, we have all kinds of wares and ceramics from that part of England that we find on these sites, West Country wares. Totnes is 10 miles upriver. We find Totnes wares on the Chadbourne site. Clearly, Lucy's family was in contact with members of the family back in Dartmouth, and even in the late 1500s, several members of the family had been mayors of Totnes. So you're going to find these sorts of ceramics here, as whether other local wares like North Devon ceramics. And in fact, this is a replica plate that we had made by my friend Martha Sollier, who's the former potter at Plymouth Plantation. I said, hey, if I give you a couple pieces, can you make me a whole one? What it would have looked like? So there you go. And then we found other artifacts as well too, like here's a cloth seal that would have been attached to a bolt of fabric with Somerset 1671 on it. So you know where it came from. So that is to say that people in northern New England in the 17th century were a diverse lot. And the example I love to give of that is William Phipps, of course, the future treasure hunter, Sir William Phipps, future first world governor of Massachusetts Bay, was born up in Woolwich, Maine, in a West Country longhouse that was 15 feet wide. We know from archaeology, 72 feet long, 15 feet wide. The family lived in one end, their livestock lived in the other. It's a very good traditional medieval way of living, common in the West Country of England, even into the 17th century. And that's exactly what the Phipps were doing. And again, widespread presence of all of our archaeology sites. Here you can see some of those North Devon, those West Country ceramics from the Demers collection down in Newcastle. That's probably about half the collection you're looking at right there. And Sgraffito wares too. So that is to say, hopefully I've given you a slightly different view of what New England might have looked like in the 17th century. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer any questions or to just break and have refreshments.
No, definitely so many questions and well, we've got you.
Or you want-
It's fantastic.
in case anyone-
Oh, thank you.
anyone
Yeah.
on this.
I have a good question.
Sure.
There was some confusion about how the Native Americans could communicate with the British, the Master colony, especially when they were trying to draft up a treaty or deed.
Yeah.
Whatever it may be. And then I understand that back in the mid 17th century, the Harvard established a college.
Yes.
Native American, before all that assimilation crap down there.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. There were never very many, though, that actually, I think only about 9 or 10 Native Americans ever attended Harvard in the 17th century. It wasn't a successful experiment. And in large part because they all ended up dying of like smallpox and other stuff because the Native Americans are being worked. Same deal. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. My old advisor wrote about James Axtell wrote an article on the founding of Dartmouth called something like the real Little Red Schoolhouse. You see, what we do know is that here's the deal: the English and the Native Americans here got along because they both liked to trade with each other, because they both were really good traders, and they both thought they were basically taking advantage of the other side. I think we all know deep down as shrewd Yankee traders, we like to trade, but the real trade is one where both sides thinks they've won, right? Well, that's what was going on here with the fur trade in the 17th century. So pretty early on, we know that people got to the stage where they started learning each other's language, and there would be enough folks even for who could interpret. We do know even before the English permanent settlers here, there's a description even in 1605 of an encounter by one of the early explorations on the coast where they run into a ship, a Basque shallop, they describe it. It's being manned by Native Americans wearing European clothes and basically speaking probably Basque or French, at least enough Basque or French so they could make themselves understood to the English. Sort of speaking that sort of trade language of the day. So I think that, it was to their benefit on both sides to have at least one or two folks in both camps who could serve as translators. Now, of course, by the time you get to King Philip's War and people are taken captive, it becomes a lot more folks. And even though Harvard didn't have a very successful with a praying school, if you will, you do have praying Indians, and Reverend John Eliot, who in the 1660s, I think it's 1662, translates the Bible into actually really sort of a dialect of Massachusetts. So I think people on both sides were, and Roger Williams, of course, too, is another one. So there were folks that knew the language well enough. Now, but to your question specifically about those deeds, and I've written lots on this, probably more than you care to hear about. But to me, the bottom line is that, think about this, not only could the natives, most of them, not read English, most of the English here, probably no more than 50, in Maine, probably no more than about 50% of the adult males were signature literate, which is not the same as being fully literate. And also too, today we think of, you learn your reading and writing. Back then, they were separate skills. A lot more people could read than could write. So you'd almost have to get essentially like a notary to come and write up the deed. And it's what you're seeing is a written version of an oral agreement that's then read out to both sides, probably translated. And then everyone agrees, they have a meeting of the minds and they sign the document. Because that's what I think would have had to have happened for these agreements to work. Because, and again, too, a lot of times the English guy who's buying the land signs it with his mark because he's not literate either. So it was you had to sort of trust in the notaries. And also too, I'd say is, again, like I think most of these trades tended to be pretty legitimate. And the reason I say that is because if you read the deeds, invariably there'll be clause Sagamore Rowells saves for like he and his descendants in perpetuity the right to hunt and fish on the land and plant on the land. Now, if you think about this, today when we buy or sell houses, we always dicker over things, right? It's like, okay, I'll give you your asking price. And I get the riding mower and that stair and that really nice carpet stays on the stairs. You go, no, you can have the mower, but not the carpet, right? Well, think about this. If you have a deed where the Native Americans have their right to continue to use the land, if you're buying a house today, are you going to let the people you're buying it from continue to use the in-ground pool whenever they want? Of course you're not. Are you going to suggest that? Heck no. So if that's in the deed, that the Native Americans maintain the rights, who's got to be asking for that? The Native Americans. So again, to me, it's like, were there occasional deals that were lubricated, shall we say, with alcohol in the trade? Probably. But I think overall, we sell Native Americans short if we think that they were being cheated and swindled all the time. The question is the land is in the eye of the beholder. If you're Sagamore Rowells and in these virgin soil epidemics, you have lost 70 to 90% of your population. You don't need all this land. And a matter of fact, again, having a local English trading post is kind of handy. I mean, as a nation, we're not always that fond of places like Walmart, but I'll tell you what, come Sunday night when no other place is open and I need something, I'm hightailing it over there to buy something, right? There's a convenience factor. Same thing too with fur trading posts. Your gun's broken, you need a new one. It's getting cold, you want a nice blanket for winter. It's nice having the Chadbournes right there with their trading posts, so you don't have to go all the way down to like Portsmouth or Massachusetts to get trade goods. So that's a really long answer to your question. I hope that it is. We could talk all night about that. I won't bore you.
Another day, right?
Anyone else want to dare a question after that?
Let me see if there's anybody online want to raise your hand if you want to ask Tad a question. You can unmute yourself. All right. Great.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes.
You're welcome.
excellent. And so I guess I do have a question for you. So all of this is still on display. Is this a
No,
permanent
I'm
display?
sorry.
Or how's it?
No,
Yeah.
it's we have the exhibit catalog. I actually do have copies of it in my car if people want to
Okay.
buy a copy. Actually, I think someone actually brought one in. The main exhibit left, all we have is the catalog. But we do last summer, we did open a new small permanent exhibit in the counting house. You've been in there. That whole sort of front hallway includes elements from the Forgotten Frontier exhibit, including the Native American encounter, including sort of daily work and trade and life. So you can still, in season, next May, mid-May, when it opens up again for the summer, you can certainly see that. And so some aspects of it are, and there's also some things up on the second, some artifacts in the Chadbourne side are up on the second floor as well too. So
And this is located where exactly?
Counting House Museum, South Berwick, right at the right off of Route 4, right as soon as you come in the States. So just go up, just go up to Route 4, turn left, and just don't go over the bridge to New Hampshire.
The original pictures of Blackwell and the others, they're on display in the cafeteria at the middle school.
Are they really? I've been, I've
I've seen them there.
cool. I haven't.
We took one down from middle school and put up an exhibit down in elementary school.
Oh, wonderful.
Unless they changed it, they're in the
Oh,
cafeteria.
good. Oh, that's great.
Those big panels.
Good. All right. Sounds like a field trip.
Research on Blackwell. Do you ever have any thoughts about the possibility of being related to Blackwell from the chief from the hunt.
Paquantum, from the hunt, states from the hunt.
Yeah, so who sold towns the food clothes.
Well, you know, I wonder about that. I think to some degrees, though, is that, like, frankly, so the 17th century, the English did not have race as we know it. They recognized other and they recognized color. And I think to some degrees, they were probably calling anybody who didn't look like them black. But I think it's pretty clear that Paquantum would have been a pure Native American. And as far as we can, you know, again, we don't know where Blackwell came from, but we do know that the other all the Shapley slaves are referred to as Negro. So I think probably not, but I've always been intrigued by that. In fact, Blackwell was the Sagamore of Nahant, who was actually killed up on Richmond's Island in an unfortunate incident, I think 1633, where he was confused with local natives who had actually killed the local fur trader on the island, Walter Bagnell, who had actually swindled them. And I think for a long time, people questioned as to whether Bagnell was really that bad a guy. But then in the 1850s, someone was plowing out in Richmond's Island and they hit a coin hoard, a German stoneware jug from the 17th century that was filled with 80 gold and silver coins. So in a few years of fur trading, Bagnell was getting pretty rich off the natives. So I think they felt that they were being taken advantage of, which, by the way, is another reason why I always think these trades were kind of fair, because ultimately, for most of the 17th century up here, there were more Native Americans than there were Europeans. And if you tried cheating them, they knew exactly where you lived. So,
And they had a good name.
real good memory. We could talk about Richard Waldron when it comes to that too. But they did. He was the first victim in 1689 in King William's War when they attacked Dover, the Cocheco. They basically attacked his house first, and really, frankly, he had a very unfortunate and prolonged death because of that, because of the way he treated the Native Americans in the past.
Pasco Chubb was another.
Oh yeah. Well, my first job out of college was digging at Colonial Pembroke. I know Pasco Chubb. So the commander of Pemaquid, and under flag of truce, took, I think, 4 Native Americans under flag of truce as prisoners of war and then killed them. Yeah, and then, but a couple of years later, they caught up with him back when he's down in Andover, didn't they? Yeah. The good old days, folks. No, you know, seriously, this was really a very violent, bloody frontier. And when I talk about Native American raid, I could just as easily talk about English raids. I mean, there were no winners in these wars. It was a pretty brutal war. There was a lot of non-combatants killed and taken prisoner, houses burned down, things like that on both sides. For every English settlement that was destroyed, there was a Native American village that was destroyed as well too. And by the time you reach the end of this war in 1697, really this region is pretty much of a burnt over wreck, with most of the population, Native American and English, having abandoned it for safer places. So yeah, it's not one of these stories like that with a happy ending, unfortunately. No, to me, it's like maybe the moral of the story is maybe it'd be nice if we learn to get along with the folks who are different than us and the newcomers that might be a little bit different, you know.
This policy that they used to gather, take over the land from the Native Americans for the next 200 years until they got to the Pacific. They took more, using the same thing, and that was okay.
Yeah, you know,
Accepted.
I used to teach Native American history. I don't do it anymore because it always has the same unfortunate ending. And to me, like when you get to present day and you say, and the happy ending is they get gambling, which a lot of Native Americans don't even want. Yeah. We can talk about Paquantum though, because I've got to talk. We'll have to talk. I got some thoughts about all those folks down there because I just gave a talk.
If folks want to reach out to you after this, what's the best way to contact you?
Email me at Salem State, ebaker@salemstate.edu.
Okay,
Happy to answer any questions you come up with.
great.
Yeah.
We'll get that out in the newsletter, whatever.
And if you can't find it, just Google me, Emerson Baker, Salem State.
Super. Well, thank you.